All right, happening now in Saskatchewan, the English River First Nation is speaking about the 83 potential unmarked graves found at the former Beauval Indian Residential School. Let's take a listen.
The Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. So to begin our press conference, we're going to have English River First Nation Chief Jenny Wolverine speak first. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Larissa. Do I speak into the mic? Or?
Yeah. Just speak loudly for all of those.
Before we begin, I would like to ask everyone to join us in a moment of silence as we acknowledge the 93 children who never returned home. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jenny Wolverine. I'm the Chief of English River First Nation. And we come from the territory of Treaty 10. Today, I want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. So welcome, visitors. I am joined by council members Katrina Morris, Randy McIntyre, and Sandra John. I would like to thank our elders for the pipe ceremony this morning. It's always a good thing to start off in a good way with prayer. I want to thank the elders for their prayer as we continue to go through this journey of healing. Thank you for honoring those lost children and their families and the communities. As we sit here today, I am reminded that in Winnipeg, in Treaty 1 territory, survivors from coast to coast to coast of residential schools have gathered. I pray for them and all the children who were forced to attend residential school and how it disrupted their lives and connections. A little bit about myself. I'm a Dene woman and live in the community of English River, signatory to Treaty 10 territory. And we are a unique community because we are composed of Cree and Dene. And also, we have one road in and one road out. We continue to fish, to hunt, and gather and use the land as our elders and ancestors have taught us and continue to teach us. And from those traditions is far from the hustle and bustle in the city. We are all connected to the land. We know each other. We know each other's families. We know each other's children. We have a kinship system where we are connected by those beliefs and those traditions. We acknowledge what has been talked about for generations. We also know the impact of residential school to our communities. I am not a residential school survivor. I do, however, suffer from the effects and impacts because I do not speak the Dene language fluently. And that connection was lost when my grandparents and my parents attended residential school. I tell you that not for sympathy, but to show you how residential schools disrupted and continue to disrupt our connections. While the schools may be closed, the impacts affect us today through the loss of language, loss of culture, and loss of life. In 2021, English River started the process to look for our children that did not make it home from Indian residential school. We were not sure what to expect and what we would find, but we did know the stories that were shared over generations about the treatment of these students and those students who never returned home. And from those stories, we had an idea of where to look. So we began there, based on the stories that have been shared in our communities. And what we found was heartbreaking and devastating. To date, there are 93 unmarked graves, 79 children, and 14 infants. We initially issued a press release that indicated that there were 83. However, the additional number was confirmed by the archaeologist when he placed the flags the day after the news announcement. Let me be clear that this is not a finality. This is not a final number. It breaks my heart that there are likely more, or even that there's even one. The experience of residential school is horrific. Coming to the decision to share the news was a way in which we did as an effort to share information and to ensure our members were cared for, that is consistent with our values, taking care of each other and the land through connection. The last few weeks, indeed, the last few months, have been an emotional roller coaster for our community. We appreciate the respect that was shown to our community. As a community and a nation, we came together and put our elders and survivors first. We did ceremony to help them come to terms to heal with their spirit. 16 communities in the Northwest are affected by this. In the last 2 weeks, we have come together. We have visited the graves, and some graves that have been marked, allowing family members and elders to pay their respects. Saskatchewan's Northwest is not like any other region in the province. Our families are tied together. Kinship is so important. We rely on our neighbors for survival. We ask that you understand these experiences. Stories about the treatment at residential schools, handed down for generations, are based on fact. We need you to understand the dark, stark reality and give it context as to the impact on individuals, families, and communities. The discovery of the graves earlier this month was just the first step in what will continue to be a long and difficult journey. There have been 93 potential finds, but we know that's not a final number. We must continue to search these sites for more of our loved ones. To do that, we need resources. We will be a united front together with First Nations and Métis communities and governments. Together, we will call on Canada and Saskatchewan governments to join with us. It doesn't all come down to dollars and cents. We need to have a holistic approach in our communities to the healing process physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. Governments can help with all of that. It takes a whole community. We also ask Canada and Saskatchewan to accept the wrong, reflect in their approaches with Indigenous governments to ensure they are hearing our collective voices, and history never repeats itself. Acknowledge that cultural genocide, dehumanization of First Nations and Métis cultures of the past. Putting words into action, have the political will to implement the calls to action. We have heard, I am sorry. Now we need to see action from that, and that means continuing to bring home the children we lost at the hands of residential schools. Before I close, I want to thank those leaders who are here today and those that are offered their prayers and support. We often say that English River and up north that it takes a community to raise a child. And it does take a community to raise a child. We support each other, and I'm thankful for our community and their communities. Nos tia ekwe benene, our ancestral lands. We will continue to make connections and heal as we have done since time immemorial. Marcy.
Thank you very much, Chief. I'm gonna get you to switch positions with Dawn, or just actually scooch your chair over this way. Next up, we're gonna have Dawn McIntyre. Dawn McIntyre is one of the coordinators with the GPR search. She'll have more of the technical and information numbers for you. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dawn McIntyre. I have been coordinating the GPR search along with a team of elders, elected leaders, community members, and GPR specialists. I would like to thank everyone who has come together in ceremony, providing prayers and sharing their stories, as this was invaluable as we went through the search. I would like to acknowledge and thank the two elders who are sitting here with us today, that they've come forward to give us strength as we talk about this very difficult subject. And I would also like to thank my husband, Bruce, who has been providing spiritual support and conducting ceremonies for the entire team throughout this whole process. In 2021, the English River First Nation began the work to do a search of the Beauval Indian Residential School grounds. The leaders of ERFN have taken on this huge responsibility on behalf of all of the communities that are affected. Many stories have been shared with families and friends about students who did not return home. Over the course of 2 years, we searched the grounds and completed the first phase of the search. The GPR findings have produced several positive hits or areas of interest at this site, which are consistent with what we now believe are 93 possible unmarked graves. Most, if not all, of these unmarked graves are believed to be children, and at least 14 of them are believed to be infants. And this is based on the measurements of the soil disturbances that were detected by the GPR. We used a combination of GPR technology, geoscience, and archaeological expertise in the search, and together they produced these results. I am from the Canoe Lake Cree First Nation, and I reside on the La Plonge Reserve, the English River First Nation, with my husband and my son. All of the small communities in the northwest region of Saskatchewan are interconnected. and all of the communities in the area and beyond are directly impacted by the Beauval Residential School. My late grandmother, Marguerite Iron, attended the Beauval Residential School during the 1920s. And my father, Norman Opekukyu, attended the school during the late 1950s. The trauma that they and their fellow students suffered was brought home, and the impacts are obvious in our communities today. During this GPR search process, I have become acutely aware of how this school has impacted my own life. I am an intergenerational survivor of the Beauval Residential School. The intergenerational impacts of the Beauval Residential School are experienced not only by my generation, but also the youth, the children, and even the babies who are now being born into our Indigenous families. These impacts continue to affect us today. We are all living within an imposed cycle of trauma handed down by our parents, our grandparents, and our great-grandparents. This is because in our Indigenous culture, we experience our lives collectively. What happens to one Indigenous person has a ripple effect on the family, the community, and the entire Indigenous nation. A number of Beauval Residential School survivors from various communities collaborated, and they developed a collective statement to be shared today. I was asked to deliver this statement on their behalf, and I am honored to do so. So, in the words of the survivors, the GPR findings were shared with our local communities 3 weeks ago. There was an immediate effect on the survivors when they heard the news. Their immediate response was shock, and then there were tears, and there was anger. Many survivors felt re-traumatized, and many were triggered into reliving the horrific memories of their childhood. There are many survivors and intergenerational survivors who are right now feeling overwhelmingly immense sadness or even depression over the GPR findings. We, the survivors, call on all Canadians to acknowledge the truth of the full, horrifying history of the IRS system as a part of colonialism and its impacts. We, the survivors, have had to process the fact that these children and infants did not make it home. We are witness to the immediate families traumatized by the deaths of their loved ones in the IRS system. We continue to reconcile with the deaths of our loved ones who are still dying from unprocessed traumas of the IRS system and the intergenerational impacts. We, the survivors and our communities, have been and are burying our relations at an epidemic level, from drug and alcohol-related deaths, violence, and suicides. We are reconciling with this harm at personal, family, community, and nation levels. We, the survivors and descendants, are still struggling, processing, and reconciling the cultural genocide, dehumanization, and trauma from the state. We are at various stages of reconciliation and recovery. We, the survivors, call on all Canadians to acknowledge the policy of wardship and the separation of Indigenous children from their families and communities. There continues today to be collective incarceration of Indigenous children who experience physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual harm as part of the IRS legacy. Again, we call on all Canadians to acknowledge these truths. We, the survivors, wish to respond and process the re-traumatization using our own Indigenous protocols. Many survivors wish to reconcile individually through traditional ceremonies and memorials. We wish to turn to our ways to reconcile our self-concept and our Indigenous identity. The IRS system caused intergenerational and ongoing impacts. Canadian support is required for ways and means to address the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual harm. We, the IRS survivors, call on the federal government to properly provide for immediate resources for a culturally appropriate memorial for the unmarked graves, and to erect a commemoration monument detailing the history of the Beauval IRS system and its impact. And this is to ensure that IRS systems will never again happen in the future. We call on the federal government to provide permanent and sustainable funding for Indigenous healing centers, controlled and managed by Indigenous people, to address the intergenerational harm of colonization and the IRS systems, and to ensure that this is a priority of governments and churches. We call on the federal government to move forward in respecting Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination and as sovereign nations, to implement Indigenous governance with our own Indigenous constitutions, acts, and laws. We call on the federal government to commit to true reconciliation, affirming Article 45 of the TRC call to action. We call on the federal government to respect the right to self-determination by providing capacity and resources to address housing, education, employment, and economic development from the Indian monies of the federal government consolidated funds. We, the IRS survivors, call on the Roman Catholic churches to respect Indigenous rights with regards to Indigenous culture, ways, and to provide the opportunity for spiritual reconciliation. And we call on the Roman Catholic Church to provide sustainable funding as committed to by the Roman Catholic Church to support and assist with the harm caused by the IRS system. We, the survivors, call on both the federal government and the churches to continue to sustainably provide for cultural competency training about colonization, including the IRS systems within the state. We call on the federal government and the churches to recognize the value of Indigenous involvement and participation toward healing and wellness practices, specialized treatment for Indigenous people by Indigenous people, and culturally relevant and appropriate ways. We call on the federal government and the churches to assist in strengthening Indigenous cultural and language rights revitalization and preservation. We, the survivors, call on all levels of governments and the churches to take action. Reconciliation is a Canadian problem, and the impacts of colonialism must continue to be addressed, and we must do it together. Finally, we ask that the government have the political will to see the TRC calls to action to reality. Indigenous voices must be heard to influence change, to transition out of colonial perceptions and systemic racism, so we can all move forward with the immense wealth of knowledge from the Indigenous people and their skills and their expertise and their ways that will help all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm just gonna get you guys all on down again. So our next speaker will be.
We have been
a
listening
Middle
to
Lake
an
Tribal
update
Council
on the discovery of unmarked graves at the former Beauval Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan. Officials now say 93 potential unmarked graves have been discovered. Of those, 79 are children, 14 potentially are infants. Now, this is 10 more potential graves than initially announced earlier this month, but they say there could be more. And you heard a number of calls made to the federal government and the church, including for a monument to ensure history does not repeat itself, funding for Indigenous healing centers, and to take action toward reconciliation.